Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of City Beats. I'm Efrem Smith. So glad to be with you. And I just want to remind you, especially if you're watching this for the first time, please subscribe on the YouTube channel, City Beats, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcast and let people know about this. We want to reach as many people as possible through this podcast because we are living in an ever-increasing urban, multi-ethnic, multicultural reality. And so to understand the heartbeat of the city, to understand what it means to be urban, to be metropolitan, is something that's good for all of us. And so glad once again that you're joining me for City Beats. And my guest today is Marcella Pelz.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
We like to call you MVP around here.
Yes. You know what? I married my husband so I can get the initials. So, hey.
So you could get that, the initials MVP?
Yeah.
All right. So, Marcella, you are in ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So I am honored and privileged to be a teammate with you here at Midtown Church. And you're an entrepreneur. And so you do event coordination and event setup. And you just all around just Renaissance woman.
Just a little bit of everything.
Just a little bit of everything. And your story, specifically your cultural ethnic story, is one that is going to be at the core of this episode. Unfortunately, we have seen around the country, especially in the last 12 months, violence against Asian American groups connected to the COVID virus, connected to racial profiling, connected to systemic racism, if we just want to name what it is. A recent shooting where a man went into spas and killed a number of Asian Americans, but there have been Asian Americans that have experienced violence on subways, light rail trains, in stores, in parking lots. And this has really been connected to the way in which some people have either promoted or bought into a narrative that it's the Asians that caused all this. They're the reasons that people have tested positive for COVID, that people have died, that COVID made it here to the United States because of these Asian people. And even some people of influence using phrases like the Chinese virus, the Chinese flu. I heard somebody say the Kung flu, which that's disheartening.
It is.
And so we're going to get to that and talk about how, as people of faith, as people of goodwill, how do we navigate these moments so that we can serve as reconcilers, as bridge builders, as transformers in the midst of this. But before we get there, you have your own story. Because it's important that we just don't put all Asian people groups, our Asian sisters and brothers, all in one group, like they're all Japanese or all Chinese or all Korean.
The main continents one there, right?
So you are Southeast Asian.
Yes.
Hmong.
Yes.
When I lived in Minnesota, born and raised in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and before I left in 2010 to move here to California, I found out that outside of Southeast Asia, that Minnesota had like the highest population of Hmong people, of Southeast Asians, outside of that region.
It is, and that's a huge thing because that's where a lot of our Hmong community has established their own businesses, kind of like there's a Chinatown and a Japantown, there's like a Hmong town. And so that's a huge success and a huge win for our people.
So Marcella, talk about your own story. So talk a little bit about your family. Are you a second generation, third generation immigrant, or no? Are you 2 or 3 generations of being in the United States? Because that's part of the stereotype too, right?
It is.
People just assume you're Asian, and if you speak your original language, your first language in your culture, that must mean you just got here last month or 2 years ago.
Yes, or sometimes I get the encounter and people meet me and they'll say, gosh, your English is so good. Where are you from? And I kind of want to just giggle and tell them, like, I'm from America because I'm born here. But I do understand they're trying to understand like my ethnicity and where I came from, because they're just so surprised that I'm well spoken and I have my English doesn't sound broken, which is what they're thinking. Most people do. But I am actually first one born here in my family lineage, and it's on my mother's side. It gets a little confusing because I come from an ancient culture where men can have more than one wife, and so that always gets tricky too when my parents came to America, because America was not for that. I mean, I'm not for that. Okay, I'm American born, so I cannot handle if there's more than one wife. We're not in a village somewhere in Southeast Asia, but my family came because of the Vietnam War. And whenever I tell that story that they came from the Vietnam War, actually a lot of people think we're Vietnamese, but we're not. And our story is quite one for the history books that didn't exist for a long time. That confused me as a child when I would learn about the Vietnam War history. Our people were wiped out of the history books. You wouldn't see our people. But our people were quite significant. They actually helped fight the Vietnam War with America, with the CIA. And a lot of people didn't know that. And I believe it was only about maybe 10 years ago, maybe I was in about my late 20s, that people started to hear more of what we did for that part of the world, how we fought with America. But for my family, it was quite a challenge when they came, because everyone just assumed everyone came from Vietnam, so they're all Vietnamese, or they came from refugee
is
camps.
Laos the native land for Hmong people? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so Hmong people are, they're hill tribe people. So they live in a lot of the parts of the land of the country in Southeast Asia that's very difficult to farm. And so they live in like the mountainside, the hillside. So a lot of them reside in Laos, and they reside in Vietnam, southern China, and Thailand. So that's where the majority of the Hmong reside.
And is there a certain, so why the ethnic cultural description of Hmong? What's the roots of that? So why since they live in Vietnam, why the distinctiveness from Vietnamese or from Laotian?
Yes. So the biggest distinctiveness is we practice different cultural ethnic heritages, like what we believe, how our customs are, and the way that we dress. So even within the Hmong community, we can tell the difference between if you're Hmong Chinese, or if you're Hmong Vietnamese, or if you're Hmong Laotian, because of the way we wear clothes, and it's adapted to that environment. There is no country for our people. We're kind of we're just the mountain people of the villages there, if that makes sense. And we're one of many, many small groups. There's the Tai Dam, there's the Laotian of course, is the country, but within Laotian, there's quite a few people, like the Miens, the Hmongs, the Tai Dams. There's all these tiny, the Khmus, so many little Asian groups that make up Laos, if that makes sense. But we're not Laotian. We're just a part of the life there.
Yeah. So, so for you're, what was your journey like becoming Christian? Because that had to be a huge thing. I mean, there's some stories that I've had the privilege of hearing and receiving where if someone Hmong became a Christian, that there was difficulty retaining relationships with their siblings or with their parents. And so talk about the decision for you of why you sensed this this call, this invitation to become a Christian, and how that impacted your family connection.
Yeah, well, a lot of Southeast Asian cultures are really tight-knit communities. And so when our parents came to the U.S., they would teach us about our culture and our religion, because America was so new. And outside of their villages, they never knew there was a world bigger than that. You know, they lived in bamboo huts, no running water. They had their babies in the jungle. There was no medical team. They just took care of each other with herbs and stuff like that. So when they came to America and they experienced America, they held on real tight to their culture. So I'm one of many, many children in my family, but I'm one of the children that my parents instilled as much of the culture as they could. And there's several of us that they did that with, whether it's the way that we do our customs or how we honor our ancestors. And quite frankly, I love that part about my culture. I love that we honor our the people that have passed on. Every time we do a celebration, my parents would burn incense and set out food for elders that have gone and thank them for their life before. So there's a lot of gratitude in that. And because I grew in the culture, I get to see and experience that part of the culture. And oftentimes when I meet Hmong Christians who may not have grown up in it, they definitely feel a different type of way about how the culture practices their spiritual beliefs, that it can go against God's will or God's word. But as a Hmong Christian that became a Christian as an adult and not growing in the Christian community, and I'm grown in the Hmong community, I just can't fathom the idea of why God would put me in this beautiful community just to take me away. But I do understand that God loves my community, even if they don't know him, just like I didn't. And he's working on them every time someone says hello to them from the Christian community. And that's true to my life. I've always had great experiences with Christians that never judged me for the things that I've done, but came alongside me in my college years, never pushing Christ on me, but always inviting me into their circle, even though I felt uncomfortable. And that's something I hold dear to because of not feeling judged by who I was or my character, or because I was not dressing good back then, you know. Before Christ, I was not appropriately dressing. I definitely didn't definitely said a lot of cuss words back then. You know, I grew up in the 209. That was just part of your language. But no one ever judged me. And it wasn't until I was 25 that I actually decided that I wanted to walk with God. And it was because someone invited me to a church to listen to a sermon. And in fact, this church was quite surprising because it's out in Roseville. And it was called the First Church of Nazarenes. And it was majority populated of a white population. They had a few members that were of other ethnicity, but they had this pastor, this amazing pastor that came from Tennessee, and he actually played this video. You know the big screen TVs we have at our house right now?
Yeah.
Okay, back then, that was the size of their TV, but their sanctuary was, it looked like an upside-down boat. That's all I remember, because they had these, like, pillars.
Yeah, you know, there's a story behind that, you know, that, you know, speaking of Asian Americans and different groups and leaders. One of my mentors, he was my professor in my doctoral studies, one of them, Sung Chun Ra. And he talks about the history of the American church and how a lot of the sanctuaries were built like upside down boats because they were like Noah's Ark. Because the whole metaphor was like, you know, escape the world, the sins of the world. So the same way, because of sin and God's judgment, he called Noah to build the ark and get, you know, the animals and get his family and get them in the ark. It was like that was the metaphor of like the early churches and how they were built in the United States. So yeah, you look up and they look like
an upside down arch.
Like
yeah,
an upside down ark. They look like the bottom of a boat, with that whole metaphor of like, come in here and escape from this sinful world into God's house.
That is so funny. No, that's exactly how I felt. And so when I experienced that first time, I'm going to say it, I experienced conviction for the first time. I actually didn't know that word existed before. It's not a word that existed in my language back then before Christ. And so I just felt this overwhelming when I went to this church and saw these people, and I saw a video by Louis Giglio called How Great Is Our God. And he just talked about the magnitude of God beyond earth itself, and then brought it back to how God is within us, and just tied a little bit of science into that to make sense for someone who's outside of the church community. That helped me make sense of why this is real and this is the reality that I get to choose. And so for the first time, I felt conviction, but I didn't know until 3 months later when I finally shared it with someone who was a Christian, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's called conviction, and you're on the first steps of your walk. And I'm like, my walk to where? You know, all these crazy questions. But yeah, that was my journey. And with my culture and family, I was quite terrified to tell them, because I knew my parents were preparing me for a new future of this Hmong generation that they didn't want to lose, because they knew they were getting older. You know, my parents had me when they were in their mid-30s, and so it's quite an age difference. My father passed last year, and my mom and my dad in their generation is in their 70s. And a lot of the people even in our culture now have forgotten why they came here and have forgotten the struggles that they came through because of the American lifestyle we live in. And so my parents had all those hopes and dreams held into me, and it was quite challenging But I had God to walk through that. I had the Bible, and that was all I had because I had to leave all my friends behind, all the friends that I didn't know were not healthy for me. And so I started new. I had to let go of everything, my relationships with my friends, relationships with my family, just to figure out what God wanted for me so I could approach them better and tell them about my change. And it's been about 11 years now. And it's been great. My family is a big pivotal part of my walk, and they all know I'm a Christian, and they're super loving and inviting. And my mom decided she was going to start going back to church about 2 years ago. But with that, that's never stopped me from loving them. It's never stopped me from going to visit my cousins who may have had animal worship and sacrifice for their ancestors. And then when I got married to my husband, who is white, we have a biracial marriage. And because my family knew he was Christian, they were really afraid that we would never, ever come back to the culture. But whenever we were invited, we go and we sit and eat with them. And most people in my culture that become a Christian won't hardly go back to visit their family when they're invited for these celebrations that have been practiced for thousands of years.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that,
Oh, yeah.
your husband Josh, who I know well, and your boys, and so Josh actually, in order to marry you, was willing to step into some of the traditions of your culture. So
Yes.
so you've got to share this story of. See, if I say it, it's good. People are going to
I
be like,
know,
what
I
does
know.
that mean? Like, your husband purchased you.
I know, but yeah. So the correct term is he paid a dowry price for me.
Okay.
You know, there's some cows and chickens involved too, you know, because it's like back in the day. And we had our wedding inside of my parents' house, our Asian wedding. And that's just customary. You just got married inside your parents' home. You didn't need a fancy wedding. But I remember that conversation clearly with my in-laws because they had just discovered the Hmong people too. And their church had just started doing ministry to the Hmong people. So they never heard of Hmong people before 10, 11 years ago. And so in one of the pamphlets, it kind of like God was stepping in front of me, showing them like, hey, this is what's going to happen. And so that was quite an experience, but it was all for God and all for Christ, because I told my husband, if we don't step down from our Christian high horse and really listen to my family's community and why this is necessary, they would never come witness our marriage. How could they ever witness God's love if we're not showing them, extending them, that we're willing to meet them so that they can come along with us? So yeah, that's.
And, you know, I've watched the ways in which you stay engaged with your culture. You know, tough issue to talk about, but I remember when your father passed away, and though that was such a tough time, I couldn't imagine what you were going through. The ways in which you honored your father's life, it helped me learn a lot about you and your culture, and it was a blessing to me. So even
Thank you.
when you were in the midst of grieving, you were a gift to me and to our staff here at our church, because it was just phenomenal in the way in which you honored your dad, and you gave us a window into your life.
Oh, yes. That was definitely you know, without my church family, I couldn't have gone through that. And without the support of family and friends, I don't think I could have gone through that. But God continues to work even when we're in the midst of sorrow, you know? Yeah. And I've definitely have learned that everyone has a journey and a walk, especially when they're crossing cultural boundaries, to obey God, but still love their family and find the fine line between all of that. And so definitely one to write a book about so that my children don't forget that, you know, this is where the Christianity line starts, but we'll never forget where our culture came from.
Well, this is a hard turn to make, but, you know, in the news for the last 12 months, especially, we've seen a number of just horrible incidents of violence. I mean, whether it's Asian Americans being shot or stabbed, beaten, and it's just been horrifying to see like elderly men and women. I mean, men and women in their 60s, and they're being jumped while they're walking down the street. They're being hit from behind, and it seems like it's connected to the ways in which Asian Americans are being portrayed, stereotyped, profiled in the midst of the COVID-19 virus.
Yes, and unfortunately, it stems from people in political power, I feel like, that have addressed that in a way that wasn't as helpful for the community, for our community. And I definitely, our people have been hurting this past year because of the way that it has portrayed, that you had mentioned earlier in the podcast about the Kung flu and the, the Chinese virus and whatnot. So I feel like a lot of people who are ignorant, not everyone in America is, who are ignorant, buys into those things and then make those actions, violent and hurtful. Yeah. Because there's simple things, like people might say, like, they assume that I'm Chinese, or they assume that I'm this subgroup without even asking me. And those assumptions may seem harmless at first, but if it just fell on the wrong ears, then I could easily be attacked when I leave the store, in a parking lot. I had shared a recent event with Pastor Bob about someone assuming that I was Chinese. And I just, addressed them and explained to them that it was wrong and that you shouldn't assume all Asians are Chinese. And I did explain to this woman that, I wouldn't assume that you're French.
So did she specifically say something derogatory to you, or come up to you in an attacking way because she thought you were Chinese?
No, it wasn't in an attacking way, but it was in more of a ignorant way, I would say. She held a box to my face and asked me if I read Chinese. Yeah. So to other people who are non-Asian, it may seem like something very minor, but to someone who's Asian who has to experience this their whole life, it can be quite tedious. And without all of the strength and encouragement God has prepared me for, especially during my father's passing, and being more bold in standing up for Christ and standing up for what's right, especially watching you and Pastor Bob preach about how to speak up and be more of Christ in the world, I wouldn't have been able to approach this woman and tell her that, hey, this is wrong, and it's hurtful, don't say that, and it's something you shouldn't say.
What are some of the ways that people of faith and goodwill in this moment can be bridge builders, can be vehicles of transformation and reconciliation in a time where I would imagine for many Asian Americans, there's some fear of, if I go to this place, if I'm looked at this way, am I going to be approached? Is somebody going to do something to me simply because of my ethnicity?
I think the best thing to do is beyond prayer. Prayer is great. But I think a practical thing is, if you're a bystander and you see it happening, speak up. Speak up, because a lot of the Asian community, especially our elder community that's being attacked, they don't speak a lot of English, and it's very challenging for them already. And so if you happen to be around, speak up. And I'm talking to all of our Asian community too that are around, who are American Asians who may have assimilated into enjoying the luxurious life of America. Our elderly population don't live that type of life with us. And so we just have to speak up and support one another, and not walk away, even if it sounds so subtle, like how that woman approached me, I was telling Pastor Bob when I chatted with him and my husband that I actually was so mad. I prayed about like why I was angry. And I was actually upset because the bystanders that were there didn't do anything. They just kept shopping as normal. Like everything's normal and fine. And I think if we just work on that better as a community, then it could get better. Not today or tomorrow, but in time. Hopefully when my children are older, in their 20s.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement talked about the danger, of not just those that were actually doing violence against peaceful protesters, but those that were silent.
Yeah.
Those that stood by and saw what was going on in their nation, in their communities, and remained silent. He thought that was an even larger danger.
Yeah.
Because if the assumption is, well, the majority of people aren't racist, or the majority of people aren't participating in these horrible incidents, then you go, well, then why does it keep happening? And then
Right.
It keeps happening because too many good people are silent. Too many good people just go, well, that's not my business. I just came here just to buy a few things and leave. And where, no, that is your moment. If you're a person of faith, if you're a person of goodwill, moments of injustice and brokenness and dysfunction, that's your moment to rise in some loving, compassionate way.
Yeah. Absolutely, because I think about the next generation because I have two little boys, and they're biracial. And the last thing that I don't want them to think is that they're one race that everyone thinks they are, Chinese American, which often can happen quickly because they're mixed babies. And so for the next generation, we have to work together to identify, like, it's not okay to label people in the Black and brown community. Because of what the past and the history has labeled them already. It's important for us to learn about one another and care for one another and stand up for one another. Yeah. And so that's my hope, is that we can work together better.
Okay, well, I'm going to end this episode by trying to get you to commit to come back for another episode, because there's much more we can talk about. One of the things I want to talk about is, I think African American and Asian American communities need to work together more.
Absolutely.
In bringing about change. But unfortunately, there's been some negative interactions in the past,
Yes.
Especially in this state in California and down in LA. There's been some unfortunate history, like between the African American community and the Korean community.
Yeah.
And so there are ways in which we're going to have to build bridges between our communities. And so I'd love for you to come back on another episode and we can have some conversations about that. Mm-hmm. So I just appreciate your voice. I appreciate your heart.
Appreciate you too.
And friendship with you, my dear sister. So thank you for being a part of the podcast. And again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Apple Podcast. We got this thing going, Marcella, where nobody knows what Mark looks like. Unless you're like on our staff or a part of our church or something like that, like our viewers don't really know. And so we've got this thing that if we can get 1,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, that Mark will be a guest of mine.
He'll make a special appearance
on City Beats. He will make a guest appearance.
Maybe he can do an opening and play some really cool music.
See, we haven't even talked about like all the gifts he has, but so. Tell your friends, tell your family members, get the word out, subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to Apple Podcast. And hey, we've got some great episodes this season. If you haven't watched it already, you should check out the recent episode I did with Chief Daniel Hahn, first African-American police chief in Sacramento. You should go back and check out season 1, because we are in season 2 right now. So if you have not seen any episode from season 1, oh man, you got to go back and check that out. And so please help us get the word out. Thank you so much for listening, for tuning in today, and keep checking us out here on City Beats. God bless.